Mr. Speaker, we think when it comes to a balance of having to choose between being a feminist and choose between staying with your church, we think it is necessarily the worldview that tells you that you have to live in a certain way that is always going to be more restrictive, that is always going to be more restrictive, and it's always going to lead to worse outcomes for those individuals who have to obey by those things. We think it is far more important for women to prioritise feminism because we think that leads to greater change overall and greater things in the long term. So I'm going to have two points of rebuttal before I begin my speech. First of all, should feminism be prescriptive in its means and what it tells people to do? And secondly, does change actually occur if women go relative to what they say? Because what we heard was that individuals should choose their own priorities of what they wanted to do. Because we heard a couple of things about this. Firstly, we heard that people can get lots of other things about religions, so there's value in them staying. Ronald already mitigated this to a lot by saying that you can actually do a lot of things that makes the church more fluid. So you can still get that community culture by moving to a branch of the church that supports your feminist views, which are growing in numbers. And it's really important in what people are most likely to do. You can still get those family links because you're still involved with your family. Those things are not necessarily things that you have to get by remaining in that church. Secondly, we heard that people themselves should know what's best. We think that as a matter of interest, people are still choosing to be feminists. We think by that instance, they're simply preferencing one particular viewpoint over another. They're still choosing for themselves. We think they're preferencing one or the other. We thought also that people shouldn't have to see gender as their primary determinant. But it wasn't a matter of simply deciding that you're a woman, therefore you had to do things. It was understanding that you had to necessarily prioritise either your feminist views or the church, and we told you the balance should always fall in favour of your feminist views. We also heard that we don't get to use women as something to provide social outcomes. We don't get to use them in that way. I think actually that is exactly what feminism has done for decades, and the only way it has achieved its outcomes is by using women in particular ways and using them to try and achieve particular kinds of change. You only get change through aggressive means, and you're not going to likely to get anything in the outcome. We also heard that feminism is equally likely to change as the church. We think the fundamental tenet of feminism in that women should be equal is unlikely to change, and to the extent that you can see sexist practices existing, there is always going to be opposition to those. That is never going to change. We have seen the church change. We have seen that now when you get married, you don't have to say that you love and obey your husband. We heard examples from them about how the church has changed its approach to condoms. The church does change. Feminism fundamentally does not. We also heard in terms of the fact that people can pick and choose their own religion. We think that they should do so in such a way that they choose, as I said, a particular faction of their church that seems good to them. But moreover, we thought it was a particularly insidious way that the church can try and keep people in by saying, well, we fundamentally think that you're morally abhorrent because of the things that you're doing in your own time, but we'll let you stay here. Because we think that's a particular way in which they can avoid ever having to deal with those problems, ever having to change to deal with those problems, and ever accepting those people in any meaningful way. We think it allows people, we think there's a real active harm to those people in the feelings of guilt and shame they have to feel. That's a real thing that exists. They didn't get rid of that. We think, moreover, in terms of different interpretations, as I said, go somewhere that actually accepts your interpretation. That's where you actually get more independence in your choice of what you think the church should be. Secondly, does change actually occur whether this woman go or stay? Because we heard there was this really great debate occurring between individuals in the church about what was occurring, and by having feminists stay there, they were going to talk to lots of people. We think that the debate is not really occurring inside the church. It's occurring largely at the church by people outside it, telling them that it's not acceptable. But moreover, to the extent that it is occurring, we don't think people who hold such strongly held views as people tend to do when religion, which is so core to them, are actually listening to the other side of that. We think people probably hold completely different views, maybe have a chat about it, and then walk away with the exact same views they had beforehand. We think we need a strong message by saying that people care enough about this to actually walk away from that church, which we heard was so important to them. Moreover, we think that we can actually see the church doesn't actually end up doing things by seeing the people who agree to be with them are actually going to do that. We also heard that because the church is changing, so because they now approve of condoms, that means that you're actually already getting change. The only point where you actually get change is because you see that people are conscientiously objecting to it outside of it. We think you're more likely to get change like that if you say that women who care enough about feminism, women who actually are feminists, have to leave the church in order to try and be consistent with their worldviews. You're more likely to get that change at level because you end up with a broader support base for that movement, and you're more likely to garner movement. So I'm going to have two substantive points in today's debate. Firstly, about how remaining in churches necessarily detracts from feminist movements and why consensus is important. And secondly, about what happens to those women who are not defined as feminists. Because we think that fundamentally, for the women who actually, if women who are feminists stay within that church, that fundamentally undermines feminism and what it means and what it should be. We think it is always feminists who have pushed for change in social outcomes. We think it's always going to have to be them to do it. We think we want it to be aggressive and we want it to be in that way. Why is it problematic for women who define themselves as feminists openly stay behind? Firstly, because it lessens the capacity of other feminists to champion their causes, because it allows the church to point and say, look, we've got feminists, they like women, they agree with us. And it means that people can say that they necessarily, no one actually cares about it. We think that when you can have some degree of agreement over what's okay, then it's not. Secondly, because it gives the church unusual exclusion from the scope of feminist causes. Because as Ronald pointed out, there is no other area that feminist causes have not been able to push back against. Simply because the church can say we have members who are feminists means that they can exempt themselves from ever having to be criticised, and we think that's particularly problematic in this case. And secondly, what do we think the benefits are in terms of having a united front and a consensus on what feminism is? Because we think feminism should be prescriptive to some degree in terms of defining what they want to achieve and what they should get. We think it's really important to generate consensus because that helps you in several ways to achieve your aims. We think if a feminist sees a woman who defines herself as a feminist remaining behind, that necessarily changes what people consider what feminism to be. That creates greater divisions between it. A divided movement is far less likely to achieve societal outcomes, and we think that that's problematic. But we think also that we can make the claim that feminists and all feminists universally reject all churches with particular doctrines, that's a far more powerful method. We think it means that all of a sudden you can't remain neutral anymore. You can't say, well, I'm not really sure on this issue. If you are staying in that church, that means you care less about issues for women than you do about your church. You can no longer remain neutral. We think it's really good to push people into having to take particular views, because what that means is all the people who they said were having great discussions right now, all of a sudden actually had to take a stance in those discussions, because if they were remaining behind, that was a view that they held. We think that then that makes people think more about what their stances actually are, and they're more likely to actually consider whether they do really want to remain behind in the church that tells them that they're subservient to men, or whether they maybe want to move to a different faction that's growing in numbers. We think that's more likely to make people reconsider what the debate is and what their role in it is. Second point, what we think this means for women who are not defined as feminists, and I started into that a bit then, but we think this does a couple of things. First of all, we think there's just an objective benefit for them, which Ron told you about, which is that you get better societal outcomes. So whether or not they like those outcomes, we think overall being more equal to men is something that we're happy to claim as being a good thing for women, whether they decide they want that necessarily or not. But secondly, we think it serves as a wake-up call. They can't necessarily agree with everything in their church. So there are people who disagree with particular things, and that they don't have to accept everything as it stands. So those people who do follow everything in the church as it exactly is written, we think that they maybe start to consider that the church is more flexible than they have been given license to believe, and we think that really helps. We also think it causes women to reconsider what it means to be a feminist, and maybe if they start caring about these things, they themselves are feminists, and they maybe should take action as well.
Thank Rebecca for her speech and call on Daniel to continue the University of Sydney Union case.